In the bustling city of Makurdi, a name that commanded respect and inspired awe was that of Timber, a formidable axeman with a reputation that preceded him. His name was on everyone's lips, and his neighborhood was abuzz with stories of his exploits. Timber's fearless and daring nature had earned him a loyal following, and his legend continued to grow with each passing day. However, little did anyone know that beneath his tough exterior, Timber had a soft spot for love. It was during this time that he met Cynthia, a beautiful and charming young woman who would capture his heart and change his life forever. Though Cynthia's real name was not known to many, her beauty and grace had made her a familiar face in the neighborhood. Unbeknownst to Timber, Cynthia was already entangled in a complicated web of love and violence with Suleiman, a member of the notorious Black Skull Confraternity. The Black Skull Confraternity was a group affiliated with the infamous Black Axe, but was popularly regarded as the Junior Black Axe. Suleiman's affiliation with the confraternity had earned him a reputation as a ruthless and feared individual, and his relationship with Cynthia was said to be nothing short of toxic. According to sources close to the couple, Suleiman's temper was legendary, and his anger would often boil over into violence, leaving Cynthia battered and bruised. The relationship had been ongoing for a long time, but it was clear to everyone around them that it was a ticking time bomb, waiting to unleash its fury. It was against this backdrop of violence and toxicity that Cynthia found herself drawn to Timber, the charismatic axeman with a heart of gold. As their paths continued to cross, Cynthia found herself increasingly attracted to Timber's charming and confident nature, and it wasn't long before she found herself falling deeply in love with him. As the days turned into weeks, Cynthia's relationship with Timber blossomed, and she began to see a way out of the toxic cycle of violence and abuse that had characterized her relationship with Suleiman. But little did she know that her decision to leave Suleiman would have far-reaching consequences, setting off a chain reaction of events that would change her life forever. Timber, with his chiseled features and captivating smile, was the epitome of a young, handsome man. His charm and charisma were undeniable, and it was no surprise that every lady who crossed his path couldn't help but be drawn to him. Cynthia, in particular, had fallen deeply in love with Timber, and as their relationship blossomed, she knew she had to make a choice. With a newfound sense of courage and determination, Cynthia decided to end her tumultuous relationship with Suleiman. The decision was not taken lightly, but she knew it was necessary for her own well-being and happiness. However, this new development did not sit well with Suleiman, who had grown accustomed to having Cynthia by his side. Suleiman's initial reaction was one of shock and disbelief. He had always thought that Cynthia was irreparably bound to him, and that she couldn't possibly imagine a life without him. But as the reality of the situation began to sink in, Suleiman's shock gave way to anger and resentment. He was furious that Cynthia had mustered the courage to leave him, and he couldn't understand why she would want to abandon him for someone else. As the days went by, Suleiman's anger and frustration only intensified. He began to harass Cynthia, constantly calling and texting her, demanding to know why she had left him. He alleged that he had spent a huge sum of money on her, and that she was therefore indebted to him. Suleiman's messages were laced with threats and intimidation, and Cynthia began to feel a sense of unease and fear. Despite her efforts to ignore him, Suleiman's harassment continued unabated. He would show up at her workplace, or at the places she frequented, always lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. Cynthia began to feel like she was being stalked, and the constant sense of fear and anxiety began to take a toll on her mental health. Suleiman's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. He would send her threatening messages, warning her that she would regret leaving him. He would also make veiled threats against Timber, warning Cynthia that he would harm him if she didn't come back to him. Cynthia was terrified, and she didn't know what to do. As the situation continued to escalate, Cynthia found herself living in a state of constant fear. She was afraid to leave her house, afraid to go to work, and afraid to be alone. She knew that she had to take action, but she didn't know where to turn. Timber, sensing her distress, was by her side every step of the way, offering her comfort and support. But despite his best efforts, Cynthia couldn't shake off the feeling that Suleiman was still out there, waiting for his chance to strike. As the situation continued to unfold, Timber became increasingly aware of the aggressive behavior that Suleiman was exhibiting towards Cynthia. Despite his own fearsome reputation as a member of the Black Axe Confraternity, Timber was deeply concerned about the safety and well-being of the woman he loved. He knew that he had to take action to protect her, and so he decided to confront Solomon directly. Timber's warnings to Solomon were clear and unequivocal. He was to stay away from Cynthia and cease all forms of harassment and intimidation. But despite these warnings, Solomon remained undeterred. His obsession with Cynthia had reached a fever pitch, and he was determined to do everything in his power to frustrate her and prevent her from moving on with her life. As a member of the Black Skull Confraternity, Solomon was no stranger to the violent and often deadly world of confraternity street life. But despite his own toughness and street smarts, he was still at a disadvantage when compared to Timber. As a member of the Black Axe Confraternity, Timber was a senior to Solomon, and he had a reputation for being one of the most feared and respected members of his organization. But Solomon was not one to be intimidated easily. He was driven by a twisted sense of possessiveness and a desire for revenge, and he was determined to do whatever it took to make Cynthia pay for rejecting him. He saw Timber as a rival and a threat, and he was determined to eliminate him and claim Cynthia for himself. As the days turned into weeks, the situation continued to escalate. Solomon's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent, and Timber found himself constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He knew that he had to be careful, that one wrong move could spark a violent confrontation that would put everyone at risk. But despite the dangers, Timber was determined to protect Cynthia and keep her safe. He knew that he had to be strong, that he had to stand up to Solomon and his threats. And so he steeled himself for the challenges ahead, knowing that the road to safety and happiness would not be easy, but determined to do whatever it took to get there. The tensions between Timber and Solomon had been simmering for far too long, and it seemed that a confrontation was inevitable. After a series of stern warnings, which Solomon had brazenly ignored, Timber decided to take matters into his own hands. Gathering a group of his fellow Axemen, Timber set out to teach Solomon a lesson he would never forget. The confrontation took place in a deserted alleyway, where Timber and his cohorts cornered Solomon. The air was thick with tension as Timber, his voice low and menacing, warned Solomon to stay away from Cynthia once and for all. But Solomon, fueled by his own pride and arrogance, refused to back down. What followed was a brutal and humiliating beating, as Timber and his fellow Axemen took turns pummeling Solomon with their fists and feet. Solomon was rough-handled, tossed to the ground, and kicked mercilessly, his cries of pain and despair echoing through the alleyway. The beating was relentless, with Timber and his cohorts determined to teach Solomon a lesson he would never forget. The motivation behind the beating was not just to punish Solomon, but also to deter him from any further aggression. Timber and his fellow Axemen wanted to make it clear that they would not tolerate any further harassment of Cynthia, and that Solomon would face severe consequences if he continued to pursue her. Moreover, there was an added dimension to the situation. Cynthia, the woman at the center of the dispute, was allegedly already pregnant with Timber's child. This revelation added a deeper layer of complexity to the conflict, as Timber's desire to protect Cynthia and his child became even more intense. But despite the severity of the beating, Solomon refused to be deterred. Instead, he became even more hardened, his anger and resentment towards Timber and his fellow Axemen burning brighter than ever before. As he lay on the ground, nursing his wounds and seething with rage, Solomon swore to exact his revenge against Timber. The beating, rather than serving as a deterrent, had only fueled Solomon's determination to strike back with even greater ferocity. The stage was now set for a deadly confrontation, as two rival groups, fueled by pride, anger, and a desire for revenge, hurtled towards a violent showdown. The consequences of this confrontation would be devastating, leaving a trail of destruction and chaos in its wake. In his relentless pursuit of revenge, Solomon sought out the counsel of his fellow Black Skulls, recounting the humiliating beating he had suffered at the hands of Timber and his cohorts. His comrades listened intently, their faces etched with sympathy and outrage. While some advised Solomon to move on with his life and forget about Cynthia, the majority urged him to take matters into his own hands and exact his revenge against Timber. Solomon was torn, weighing the pros and cons of each approach. He knew that if he chose to ignore the advice of his comrades and moved on, he would be seen as weak and vulnerable. On the other hand, if he chose to assert his revenge, he risked sparking a brutal and potentially deadly conflict with Timber and the Black Axe. As Solomon pondered his next move, he began to formulate a plan. He considered hiring some of his fellow Black Skulls to ambush Timber and beat him up, but he quickly dismissed this idea. He knew that if he took this approach, Timber would likely seek revenge, and the conflict would only escalate. Solomon was aware of the age-old adage that says, "The evil you fail to kill today may come back to destroy you tomorrow." He knew that if he wanted to put an end to the conflict once and for all, he would have to take drastic action. With a sense of cold calculation, Solomon decided that the only way to achieve true revenge was to kill Timber. With his mind made up, Solomon approached his fellow Black Skulls and began to formulate a plan to take out Timber. They spent hours poring over the details, carefully mapping out their strategy. Finally, the day of the hit arrived, and the Black Skulls set out to track down Timber. They eventually found him at a beer joint on Best Albino Street, surrounded by friends and acquaintances. Without hesitation, the Black Skulls opened fire, shooting Timber dead in cold blood. As quickly as they had arrived, the Black Skulls fled the scene, leaving behind a trail of chaos and destruction. The news of Timber's brutal murder spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, sending shockwaves of outrage and grief through the community. The Black Axe, in particular, was incensed by the attack, seeing it as a brazen and cowardly act of aggression by their junior rivals. In a fury of anger and revenge, the Black Axe set out to track down those responsible for Timber's murder. They eventually identified one of the alleged perpetrators, a young man who had been involved in the hit. The Black Axe tracked him down to his village, where they confronted him in the market square. Without hesitation, the Black Axe took the young man down, exacting their revenge for Timber's brutal murder. The incident sent a chilling message through the community, a stark reminder of the brutal and unforgiving world of confraternity violence. As the dust settled, one thing was clear: the conflict between the Black Axe and the Black Skulls had only just begun, and it would take a terrible toll on both sides before it was finally brought to an end.